Hello, church. It's your pastors here, Zach, Chrysalin, and Drew, and we're happy to be with you for session 3 of our identity work in Sunday school. We've been taking up really 2 key questions of identity. 1, who is God who creates the church? And 2, who are we, the church, before God? We've talked about 3 dimensions of identity that help us answer those 2 questions. We take up the second dimension today, which is the church as members of God's household with a place at God's table. We, the church, are members of God's household with a place at God's table. Before we get too far along, though, I thought we'd just talk a little bit about home. We're talking about a household, about God's household. We're talking also about God's home. And so, Zach, what is home to you when you hear the word home?
Well, I always think of when people ask me where am I from, and as a person that grew up with military folks as parents, I moved around a lot, and that was always a difficult question for me to answer. So I always just thought it was wherever my family was. It's where we made home together. Yeah.
Where your people are.
Yeah.
That's where home is. I like that. What about you, Chrysalin?
The kitchen table. So growing up, most of my childhood revolved around the kitchen. Either we were cooking a meal or laughing as we cleaned up or whatever it was. But cooking was always a part of my childhood. And even now, when I go home to see my parents and my siblings, oftentimes the place that you find us is in the kitchen. There's no comfy chairs. It's just everybody bouncing around one another, trying to cook whatever dish you are supposed to be cooking. And usually we have music going and we have a dance party in the kitchen. So, home for me is the kitchen. It's the place where I felt the most love. I experienced a lot of hands-on experience, and where we gathered.
It's a place of gathering. It's a place of energy.
Mm-hmm.
God's home is very much like that, I think, for both of us, for all of us together here. On page 25 in the reading that we've been doing, there is a description of God's home, and I want you all in your classes to take a few moments now. I'm going to read it, and I'd like for you to think about what it means to live in God's home when God's home looks like this. In many ways, our struggles of life and leadership and discipleship can be traced to our still trying to build God a temple, a home into which we might confine God, who will not be confined except by the fullness of God. The fullness of God is always pressing outward to love whoever is called the other or the not loved. This embrace is how salvation works in the household of God. God loves us back to life and welcomes us into a home not made with hands, but eternal in the heavens. In other words, God's home does not have walls to keep people out, only doors and windows into which we might welcome sisters and brothers. This essence of God's home teaches us much about the identity of God, who creates the church. Take a few minutes and talk with your class about what it means to live in God's home when God's home looks like this. I pushed the button. Now it's on.
Okay.
Are you sure?
I'm sure it's on. I hope you had some good discussion with your group after that little opening for today's class. We want to talk a little bit more about God's household. What does it mean to be a member of God's household with a place at God's table? We have to think some about what does God's household look like. And I think we find a really clear picture of God's household in the story of the prodigal son. You may have your class facilitator recap that in just a moment, but I think most of us have heard the story of the prodigal son, and it's a beautiful parable that teaches us a lot about God and about ourselves too. We found really 5 markers of God's household in that parable. The first is that God's home is a place of mercy, hope, and love. The second, God's home is a place of forgiveness and justification. The third, God's home is marked by a lavish hospitality that welcomes all. All. Sometimes we have trouble with that one. A lavish hospitality that welcomes all. The fourth one, God's home is a place where we are formed and reformed, kind of like that kitchen table you talked about earlier. And then finally, God's home is marked by serving and suffering with others. Serving and suffering with others. If you read this chapter, you heard me tell on my grandmother just a little bit, my Nana. She hates this parable. She still hates this parable. When we talk about it, she just gets visibly upset because she is both actually and I guess spiritually in her mind an older sister. She's the oldest of three. I'm the oldest of two. So we both kind of know what it is to be that older sibling. And I appreciate Nana's frustration. I wonder, do you all ever feel frustration about the prodigal son and how he was welcomed back in and didn't have to pay for all of his wrongdoings and everything?
I'm the youngest sibling, so no.
You're the youngest?
Yeah.
I'm the oldest, so yes.
Zach, leave. What do you think? What do you think? Chrislyn, how would you respond to that?
I appreciate her insight there because, I mean, I don't know
You
that...
mean my grandmother?
Yes, your grandmother's. Because I
I'll tell her.
don't know that we've been willing to say that out loud.
Right.
Like, oftentimes we would sit there and the preacher would preach the sermon about this and we would just nod our head like, yes, I agree. And even though inside of us we were thinking, no, this is not okay.
Right.
We would never say it out loud. So the fact that she was willing to name it
Yeah.
and say, this is how I feel, to be able to say that is important. And I appreciated how you called it irresponsible mercy.
Yeah.
Because that's not a word that I would have necessarily come up with. Partially because responsibility to me is a big deal. And to consider it as irresponsible to
God
give,
being
yes,
irresponsible.
exactly.
Okay.
I've never thought of it in that way, but in her perspective, and probably in the perspective of a lot of us
Yeah.
at different moments, the term irresponsible mercy would definitely play in
It
there.
fits.
It does.
It fits.
It does.
Little brother, what do you think?
I'm thinking that I do appreciate that willingness to say, yeah, this is frustrating. I think Jesus told the parables to be frustrating to people. And when we're not thinking that they're frustrating and not finding anything to argue about with Jesus on the parables, it's probably because we're saying, well, that's what God does, and we're not held to that standard, or we don't need to worry about having that same sort of irresponsible mercy towards people.
Right.
But when we apply it to ourselves, yeah, it is very frustrating and hard to wrestle with. If you're a business person, you're looking at that shepherd that leaves that flock of 99 good, healthy sheep to find one sheep that wasn't paying
Right.
attention at all, and you're probably thinking, man, that was a bad shepherd.
Yeah.
He should have just let that one go. That's the honest reaction, but it's hard to flip that and say, no, God calls us to that same level of grace with others.
God calls us to that same level of grace with others.
Mm-hmm.
That's the journey in the prodigal son. It's not to be more like the younger brother or more like the older brother, but to become more like the father in the parable, which is the one who is able to offer this lavish welcome and hospitality and love and grace, or irresponsible mercy.
There we go.
That concept of cheap grace gets thrown around a lot too. You know, if God's grace doesn't come with something else, then isn't it cheap grace? Well, no, it's a gift. It does require a response, but you don't make the response and then get the gift. You get the gift first and respond from that. Take a few minutes in your groups and talk about the notion of God's grace as irresponsible mercy, as my grandmother might call it, and then what does it mean to live in a home where grace and forgiveness and lavish hospitality are really the hallmarks to life? What does it mean to live in that kind of a home? What are the ramifications or the implications of that to live that way in this home as God's church here in Murfreesboro?
I forgot halfway through I only have one earring in.
Okay, for our last movement today, we want to talk about this last fifth marker of God's home. God is marked by serving and suffering with others. We leave the prodigal behind and we go with Jesus and his disciples on the night of his betrayal. And we find the King of Kings wrapped in a towel, washing his disciples' feet, doing the work of the lowliest servant. It's a powerful image that draws us together. It's foot washing. We're kind of scared of it in the church, although we really want to do more of that. But when we gather and wash each other's feet, we find out that we're a little bit afraid to get that close to each other, not because of ugly toes and unpedicured feet, but because we know what it really means, which is that we have signed up to serve and suffer with each other, no matter what. And that's a high calling, and it carries with it a great deal of responsibility for each other that is beautiful and wonderful, but tough. So I wanted to ask the two of you, what did you think about as you read this last part of our chapter?
Well, the thing that stood out to me was the sentence, in the home of God, we serve each other and we suffer with each other. I think sometimes when we talk about serving one another, it's kind of easy to go out and serve a meal somewhere and then leave, and leaving it all there. But when we talk about what it means to suffer with one another, it means tapping into that part of you that understands and embraces people at their worst and best moments. For me, I see this a lot, especially in hospice care. When someone is in hospice, typically we know that that person is not going to be with us much longer. And when you go to visit someone whose family is surrounding them, it's in that moment when they feel like they are suffering the most, and it's hard and it's painful. And to be able to step into that moment and to allow that moment to be, and then when you walk away, to take that with you, to remember that person, to remember who that person is and how that person affected your life, and to be with that family and to check on them again, to allow yourself to come back to be with them in the midst of their suffering. And that's a really hard thing to do because it's uncomfortable. You don't know what to say. You don't know what to do. You're just hoping and praying that whatever it is you're doing is the right thing. But then when you walk away, you don't walk away the same person that you walked in the room. You walked away changed by being present. Yeah.
You've invested in that person.
And in that family.
In that family, yeah. And that stays with you forever.
It does.
Yeah. What do you think, Zach?
Well, I was thinking about the different aspects of being parts of God's household, and thinking about earlier we asked what is home to us, and I was thinking about those things that were just a part of our family. They were just things that we did because that was the way it was. It might be make sure you come home for supper at 6 o'clock, and another one might have been going to family reunions. So you get all sorts of things that this is what we're doing because this is family, and
this is who we are.
This is who we are. And you might ask, well, why do I have to do that?
Yeah.
I asked that a lot growing up. I wasn't too happy about some of it and wanted to know why. And a lot of these things are great, being parts of God's household, hope and joy, and but the hard stuff, suffering together, we might ask God, why do we have to do this? And I think God tells us it's part of who we are when we join God's household. Ultimately, we suffer with these people and serve these people that God calls us to, not just to make ourselves feel better or to serve a need, but because they're God's people.
Right.
And ultimately, they're our people.
Right. That's so important, and yet so challenging.
Mm-hmm.
We do want to say, well, why do we have to do that? Well, it's who we are. It's who we signed on to be when we were baptized, and as part of God's church, we're called to serve and suffer with each other, even when we discover that God's home doesn't really have all the walls we think it has. God has taken down the gospel has taken down all those walls, and all of a sudden, all of humanity are our sisters and brothers, and we're called to serve and suffer with them, even when they don't look like us, they don't smell like us, they don't act like us. Those are our people, and
Mhm.
we're called to serve and suffer with them. That's a high calling, and it costs so much,
It does.
but it is worth it all.
It is.
As a way to wrap up this part of our discussion, I'm going to read the last paragraph of page 30. The home of God, in which we find our home, begins to look less like that place to which we are transported when we smell apple pie, and more like that place where the heart of God courageously intersects with the suffering of the world in the person of Jesus as made present by the Holy Spirit working in the hearts of the children of God. Whatever the case, even though that is hard for us to understand, it is home still, and we find that it is a peculiar place, full of a joyful hope that shines like a beacon, which is well acquainted with the darkness of suffering and pain. Take some time and talk about what we've learned about who we are as the people of God, as the church before God, and who is this God who is creating the church. Talk about that, and then your facilitator will wrap things up. Thank you.
Gotta go.
We got it.